The first thing I noticed was the silence on the other end of the line. Not a pause, not static. The kind of silence that means someone is choosing their words very carefully, and the words they finally land on are going to change everything. My name is Douglas Mercer. I'm 63 years old, and I spent 31 years building something that most people never even knew existed. Not a building, not a bridge, not anything you could point to on a skyline. I built a system, a benefits administration system for one of the largest municipal transit authorities in Ontario, 14,000 employees across 6 divisions, from maintenance crews in Sudbury to dispatch coordinators in Hamilton, pension tracking, health plan reconciliation, disability claims, leave management tied to collective agreements that had been renegotiated 11 times over 3 decades. I knew every clause, every exception, every workaround that existed because a clause written in 1994 hadn't anticipated something that happened in 2007. I didn't have a fancy title, Senior Benefits Administrator. That's what it said on my door and on my pay stub. What it meant in practice was that I was the person every department head called when something was about to go wrong, and they needed it to not go wrong. Quietly, without a press release, without a union grievance, without a headline in the Toronto Star about how the city's transit workers hadn't received their disability top-ups for 6 weeks. I was good at that. 31 years of good at that. And then one Tuesday morning in March, my director called me into his office, and I heard that silence, and everything changed. My director's name was Gerald. We had worked together for 9 years. He was a decent man in most respects, organized, fair, not given to dramatics. He had a plant on his windowsill that he watered every Monday, and a photo of his kids from 2015 that he'd never updated. I always found that a little sad, but he was competent, and he was honest, and I had trusted him. He looked at me from across his desk, the way a person looks at someone they owe an apology to, but haven't figured out how to deliver it yet. He said, "Doug, the executive team has made a decision about the division restructure." I waited. They're going to be contracting out the benefits administration function. I waited some more. To Praxis Group, out of Calgary. I set my coffee down on the edge of his desk. Not because I was angry. I set it down because my hands had gone very still, the way hands do when a brain is processing something it wasn't prepared for. "When?" I said. "The transition is scheduled for the 1st of July. It was the 3rd week of March. And my position?" Gerald looked at his desk. "Your position is being eliminated." I had given them 31 years. I had come in during ice storms. I had worked through a family medical emergency in 2018 because we were in the middle of the annual pension audit and there was no one else who could run it. I had trained 4 different directors, including Gerald, on the intricacies of the collective agreement benefits schedules. I had found, on 3 separate occasions, errors in the province's reporting templates that would have cost the authority millions of dollars in clawbacks if they'd gone undetected. Praxis Group out of Calgary was going to do what I did, for less money, because some vice president had read a white paper about operational efficiency and decided that institutional knowledge was a line item that could be cut. Gerald said, "You'd be expected to assist with the transition, document your processes, train the Praxis team." "How long?" I asked. "Through the end of June, 3.5 months. They wanted me to spend 3.5 months handing over everything I knew so that a contractor from Calgary could come in and do my job badly." I picked up my coffee. "I understand," I said. I didn't say anything else. I stood up, thanked Gerald for telling me directly, and I walked back to my office. I sat down at my desk. I looked at the window. Outside, it was a gray March morning, in a way that only Ontario can be gray, not dramatic, just relentlessly, practically gray, like the sky had a job to do and was doing it without complaint. I opened my computer and I got back to work, because here is something that 31 years teaches you. Reacting is easy. Everyone reacts. What matters is what you do in the 48 hours after the thing that made you want to react. The transition plan arrived by email 2 days later. It was a 17-page document prepared by the Vice President of Corporate Services, a woman named Patricia, who had been with the authority for 4 years and had come from a background in commercial real estate. She was intelligent, and she was driven, and she had exactly no experience with public sector collective agreements or the particular regulatory environment governing municipal pension obligations in Ontario. The document outlined a handover schedule. I would be expected to produce written documentation for every process I managed. I would participate in twice-weekly calls with the Praxis transition team. I would be available for questions. I would transfer administrative access to all systems no later than June 1st, 1 month before my end date, to allow for a parallel run period. I read it twice. Then I read it a third time, and I noticed something. Not a mistake. Not exactly. More like an absence. A gap where something important should have been. The document mentioned systems access. It mentioned process documentation. It mentioned schedule transfers and reporting templates and contact lists. It did not mention the audit trail. Now, I need to explain something. Over the course of 31 years, I had built something that nobody had asked me to build and nobody had formally approved. I called it the reconciliation log. It wasn't glamorous. It was a set of linked spreadsheets, cross-referenced with scanned documents and time-stamped correspondence that tracked every significant decision made in benefits administration going back to 2001. Every interpretation of a collective agreement clause, every exception that had been approved by a director or a VP, every communication with the provincial pension regulator, every time we had received guidance from legal, and how that guidance had been applied. I built it because in 2001 we had a dispute with one of the unions over a disability top-up calculation that had been done incorrectly for nearly 2 years. The grievance process was brutal. It took 14 months, and at the end of it, I realized that if we had had a clear record of the decisions that led to the error and the reasoning behind them, the whole thing could have been resolved in 6 weeks. So, I built the log. Every year, I updated it. Every time something significant happened, it went in. I cross-referenced it with the official system of record so that every entry could be verified independently. Nobody told me to do this. It wasn't in my job description. It wasn't in any policy document. It was just something I did because it was the right thing to do and because I had learned, at considerable expense to everyone involved, what happened when you didn't. The transition document from Patricia's office didn't mention the log because nobody in Patricia's office knew it existed. I thought about that for a long time. I thought about it while I started drafting the process documentation they had asked for. I thought about it while I sat on the first transition call with the Praxis team, 2 young analysts named Brendan and Simone who were perfectly pleasant and had no idea what they didn't know. I thought about it while I answered their questions carefully and completely, and in a way that told them everything they had asked and nothing they hadn't. They didn't ask about the log. By the end of April, the transition calls had a rhythm. Brendan and Simone were working through the documentation I'd produced. They were asking the right questions about the routine processes. They were not asking the right questions about the non-routine ones, the edge cases, the exceptions, the situations that only came up once every 3 or 4 years, but that could cause significant problems if handled incorrectly. I was not hiding this from them. I was answering everything I was asked. I was simply not volunteering what they hadn't thought to ask for. There is a difference. It took me a while to be sure of that, but I am sure of it now. In the second week of May, I received a meeting invitation from Patricia's office. The subject line was Transition Milestone Review. I accepted it and I showed up at 2 o'clock on a Wednesday, and I sat across from Patricia and Gerald and a man I hadn't met before, the VP of Finance, whose name was Robert, and who had the particular energy of someone who had made a decision and was now defending it rather than evaluating it. Patricia opened the meeting. She said the transition was tracking well. Praxis had received all the documentation. The parallel run would begin June 1st as planned. She wanted to confirm that I would complete the transfer of administrative credentials on schedule. I said I would. Robert said, "We want to make sure this goes smoothly, Doug. For everyone." I said I understood. Gerald said nothing. He looked at his hands. Patricia said, "Is there anything you need from us to complete the handover?" I looked at her for a moment, and I thought about the log, and I thought about what the log contained. And I thought about the fact that we were 6 weeks away from Praxis taking over a system they didn't fully understand, in a regulatory environment they'd never worked in, managing collective agreement obligations they had never encountered. I said, "There are some materials I've maintained over the years that aren't in the official system. I'd like to discuss the best way to transfer those." Patricia said, "What kind of materials?" I said, "Documentation, decision records, correspondence with the pension regulator going back about 20 years, interpretive guidance that was applied to specific situations." There was a silence. Robert said, Are these in the system of record? I said, they're cross-referenced with the system of record. The underlying decisions are in the official files. What I have is the explanatory layer, the context. Patricia said, why isn't that in the official system? I said, because nobody asked me to put it there. I built it on my own initiative. It's been useful. Another silence. Robert said, can you include it in the documentation package? I said I could. What I did not say is that including it in the documentation package without explanation was roughly the same as handing someone a detailed map of a city they'd never visited in a language they didn't speak. The map contained the information. Understanding it was a different matter. I went back to my office. I thought for a long time. I called my daughter. She lives in Vancouver now, works in employment law, sharp as anyone I know. I explained the situation. Not all of it. Enough. She said, Dad, you have 31 years of documented decisions in a system nobody else has access to. I said, yes. She said, and they're letting you go. I said, yes. She said, and they need that information for the transition to work. I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, what are you going to do with it? I said, I'm going to do the right thing. She said, define right thing. I said, I'm going to give them everything, properly documented, properly explained, in a way that actually serves the organization. She said, and? I said, and I'm going to make sure that how I do that is documented too. She understood. She's a lawyer. She said, make sure everything's in writing, every request, every response, every meeting note. I already was. Here is what I knew that nobody else in that building had thought about yet. The log wasn't just a record of decisions. It was a record of why decisions had been made. And in a regulated environment, the why is often more important than the what. If Praxis took over administration and encountered one of the edge cases, and they would, because edge cases are not hypothetical, they would need to understand not just what the correct answer was, but the regulatory reasoning that supported it. Without that, they might apply a technically correct procedure in a context where it would produce an incorrect outcome. And in municipal pension administration, incorrect outcomes don't stay theoretical. They become grievances. They become audits. They become headlines. I had 3.5 months of experience watching the Praxis team. They were not incompetent. They were simply inexperienced in exactly the ways that would matter most, in exactly the situations they were least likely to anticipate. I began to prepare a proper transfer document, not the cursory process descriptions I'd been producing. A real document, annotated, contextualized, with a section for each category of exception and a cross-reference to the specific collective agreement provisions and a note on every instance where we had received guidance from legal or from the pension regulator that affected how the provision was applied. It took me 3 weeks of evenings and weekends. I sent it to Gerald on a Thursday morning in the last week of May, 1 week before the system access transfer was scheduled. I CC'd Patricia and Robert. I included a cover note explaining what the document was, how it had been developed, and why it would be important for the Praxis team to review it before the parallel run began. I suggested that a structured walkthrough would be advisable. 2 or 3 half-day sessions with Brendan and Simone. I offered to facilitate. Gerald called me that afternoon. He said, Doug, this is very thorough. I said, I know. He said, where did this come from? I didn't know any of this existed. I said, you never asked. But it's been there. I've been maintaining it since 2001. A pause. This is going to be a problem. I said, it doesn't have to be. He said, Patricia is saying this should have been in the system of record. I said, Gerald, with respect, if I had put every informal guidance note and every exception reasoning in the system of record would have been unusable. What I built was the practical layer on top of the formal layer. Most organizations have something like it. Usually it lives in one person's head. I happen to write mine down. Another pause. Praxis doesn't have the capacity to absorb this before July 1st. I said, I know. He said, what do you want, Doug? I want 31 years to mean something. I want a vice president from commercial real estate to understand that institutional knowledge is not a line item. I want the 14,000 people whose benefits depend on this system to not be harmed by a decision made in a boardroom by people who didn't know what they didn't know. That's what I wanted to say. What I said was, I want a proper transition, which is what I've been building, and I want it on record that I flagged this concern formally, in writing, in sufficient time for the organization to address it. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. He said, "I'll talk to Patricia." The meeting happened on a Tuesday. Patricia, Robert, Gerald, Brendan, from Praxis, and a senior partner from Praxis I hadn't met before, a man named Wayne who had the look of someone who had just been shown a scope of work considerably larger than the one he'd quoted on. I walked them through the document. I was calm. I was precise. I answered every question fully. When Wayne asked how long it would take his team to properly absorb this material, I said, in my professional judgment, a minimum of 6 to 8 weeks of dedicated review, plus the structured walkthrough sessions. Wayne said, "That pushes well past July 1st. I said, "Yes." Robert said, "What are our options?" I said there were 3. 1. Proceed with the July 1st transition as planned, accept the knowledge gap, and manage the resulting risks reactively. 2. Delay the transition to allow for proper knowledge transfer. 3. Extend my engagement either as an employee or as an independent contractor through the knowledge transfer period to ensure it was done properly. I slid a 1-page summary across the table. I had prepared it in advance. Robert looked at it. He looked at Patricia. He looked at Wayne. Wayne said, "We can't absorb this in 6 weeks. I'll be honest with you." Patricia said nothing. Robert said, "Doug, if we were to consider option 3 an extension, what would that look like?" I said, "I'd want a proper consulting agreement, fixed term, defined scope, appropriate rate for a senior specialist engagement." Robert said, "What rate?" I named a number. It was not a modest number. It was the number my daughter had helped me calculate, based on what a genuine expert in this specific regulatory area would cost on the open market, which was, it turned out, considerably more than my salary had implied. Robert looked like he was doing math in his head and not enjoying the result. He said, "Give us a week." I said I would. I drove home that evening on the 401 inches, the particular kind of late spring Ontario traffic that gives you a lot of time to think. The sky was doing something complicated to the west, turning colors that didn't have good names, pink into orange into a deep gray that wasn't quite purple. I had the radio off. I thought about my father, who had worked 34 years for a company that made industrial gaskets and retired with a handshake and a gift card. I thought about my mother, who always said the difference between a person with leverage and a person without it is that the person with leverage wrote things down. She hadn't meant it as career advice. She'd said it about a dispute with a neighbor over a fence line, but she had been right about it in every context I'd ever tested it in. They came back in a week with a counter-proposal. It was lower than what I had asked. I made one counter. We settled. The agreement was a 6-month consulting engagement at a rate that worked out to roughly 40% more per month than my salary had been. I was engaged as an independent specialist in pension and benefits administration for public sector collective agreements. The scope was explicit: structured knowledge transfer, praxis team mentorship, regulatory compliance documentation, and availability for questions during the transition period. I signed it on a Friday afternoon. Gerald shook my hand. He looked relieved and a little ashamed, and I understood both of those things. The next 6 months were the most focused work I had done in years. Not because I was trying to prove something, because the work mattered, and I finally had the structure to do it properly. Brendan and Simone turned out to be genuinely good analysts, curious, diligent, willing to sit with complexity rather than paper over it. By month 3, Brendan was catching nuances in the collective agreement language that I wouldn't have expected him to see for another year. Simone built a tracking system for the exception categories that was, honestly, better organized than what I had built in 2001. The transition happened in January, not July. It happened correctly. 2 weeks after Praxis formally took over, I received an email from Robert. It was brief. He said the January transition had gone more smoothly than any major system changeover he had overseen in his career. He said the documentation I had produced was being used as a model for how Praxis would approach future municipal contracts. He thanked me. I read the email twice. Then I forwarded it to my daughter. She wrote back 3 words. "Told you so." I didn't return to that office again after January. I finished the consulting engagement from home, answering questions as they came in, which they did regularly for the first month. then occasionally, then rarely. Brendan called me in April about a specific provision in the Hamilton Division's agreement. We talked for 40 minutes. He had the right answer before the call was over. He just needed to hear himself say it out loud to someone who knew what he was talking about. That's usually what expertise transfer actually is. At the end of it, not documents, not training sessions. Conversations where the person learning already knows more than they think they do, and the person teaching creates the conditions for them to find it. I learned that in 31 years. I tried to give it to Brendan in 6 months. I think he got most of it. My contract ended in April. I was 63. I had money in a pension I had administered accurately for 31 years, because I had been very careful to make sure the system I ran worked correctly, and I was in it. I have a daughter in Vancouver who is better at employment law than I was at benefits administration, which is a satisfying thing for a father to be able to say. I have a lot of mornings now that I didn't used to have. I drink coffee on the back deck and watch the birds argue over the feeder my wife put up 3 springs ago. The 401 is somewhere to the north, and I don't think about it much. But sometimes people ask me at the neighbors in summer, or at the curb waiting for the grandkids after school. They ask me what I did for work, and I tell them, and then they ask what I would tell someone who is where I was, sitting in Gerald's office on a March morning with a silence on the other side of a desk. I tell them this: write things down. Not because you distrust the people you work with, because the people you work with will change, and the decisions you made together will outlast the memory of why you made them. Documentation is not bureaucracy. Documentation is the difference between your expertise dying with your employment and your expertise surviving it. Know what you know, not arrogantly, precisely. There is a significant difference between believing you are valuable and being able to demonstrate it in a way that is undeniable and specific. The first is an opinion. The second is a position. Do not react. This is the hardest one. When someone hands you a piece of paper that tells you everything you've built is expendable, the instinct is to respond to that feeling immediately and loudly. That instinct is almost always wrong. What the moment calls for is not noise. What it calls for is the same methodical attention to detail that built the thing they told you was expendable. Apply that to the situation. The situation will often look very different after 48 hours of careful thought than it did in the first 48 seconds. Finally, and I mean this, though I understand it sounds simple, do good work until the last day. Not out of loyalty to an institution that made a decision you disagree with. Out of loyalty to the 14,000 people, or whatever the number is in your situation, who depend on the system being run correctly and who had nothing to do with the decision made in the boardroom. The work is not the organization. The work is the people the work serves. Keep those two things separate and the rest gets considerably easier. I was not destroyed. I am 63 years old. I have enough to be comfortable, and I have a 6-month engagement on my record that generated a reference letter from a vice president who had tried to eliminate my position and ended up paying me 40% more to stay. 31 years taught me a lot of things. The most important one it taught me at the end. What you know is yours. No elimination. Notice changes that.